Hey everybody, Marcus here. So it's really fascinating actually what's gone down in the last few days, the assassination of Charlie Kirk and the sort of reaction that people have had to it. Now, if you look at it symbolically, the man was shot in the throat. And that's where the vocal cords are. That's where speech comes from. It has that kind of poetic dimension to it. But then you can also layer on the religious symbolism of the whole phenomenon. That what John 1, you have, in the beginning there was the Word, and the Word was with God, and the Word was God. It's like the reaction that people are exhibiting to it seems to really tap in subconsciously to that dimension of it, beyond the topical rhetoric that's being spoken about, the unreasonability of speaking with the left. And you see that because people have shifted. It almost seems like the Charlie Kirk incident is the 9/11 of the Zoomer generation, because as far as I know, Charlie was quite popular amongst the college students, which would basically be the Zoomer generations, perhaps some alphas, but definitely the younger Zoomers. And that had happened on September 10th, so it's 9/11 was something that happened in my youth. So back in 2001, I would have been 19. So in university. So the 19-year-olds now had this horrific thing happen that they witnessed. And you can see the change online. I mean, people are freaking out about it. The left is celebrating it, these sick monsters that they seem to be. And you got to ask yourself, what kind of person would actually celebrate this sort of phenomenon? And I did give it some thought, and basically it's on a video that I made before talking about shame. The typical profile of a leftist, and I want to separate it a little bit from the actual political position itself, because I think it's sick people are drawn to the left, though the left also manufactures sick people as a mechanism of generating voters. But there's a certain character, certain inner world. That's a better way of describing it than character. A certain inner world that takes place in the typical leftist, specifically the ones that would have been celebrating this sort of incident. And these are people who are deeply rooted in shame. These are people who hate. They have hate in their heart, but where did that hate come from? It came from the shame that they possess, which is a resentment for being human, a resentment for being limited. Because these are people who cannot accept their own humanity, their own limits, both epistemologically, that they don't know everything, the fact that they can make mistakes, which causally makes them guilty of things. Like if you make a mistake that leads to somebody's death, you can take responsibility on your own part, knowing your part in the causal chain leading up to that. That's what we refer to as taking accountability, being responsible. But these people are infallible in their own inner world. They resent the fact that humans can make mistakes. They don't acknowledge within themselves their humanity. Therefore, they can't make mistakes. And it's that shame that builds up that comes from what Nietzsche would have called living in bad conscience. And bad conscience creates this conflict in you where intellectually you set up a reality for yourself, but you viscerally know it's not true. They viscerally understand they are limited human beings, but they cannot accept intellectually the fact that they're limited. And that creates that bad conscience that they live in. It creates that shame about themselves that they then further build defensive mechanisms to deny. And they turn into these unaccountable creatures. And so when they see somebody who, in a sense, they wish they were like, because what they would have seen in Charlie Kirk is someone who takes initiative, someone who is responsible for their own actions, because that sense of inner responsibility means they have control over their lives. You see, the beautiful thing about being responsible as a psychological position is that it's not only in the negative connotation. It is not only that you are guilty of your mistakes. It is also that you are credited with your successes. Because if you believe you are responsible, that means you have power to act and change. And Charlie Kirk was like that, regardless of whether or not anybody agreed with his position. That's completely immaterial. He was an exemplar of somebody taking initiative because his inner world reflected the fact that he believed he was responsible. And therefore, he was responsible for both the positive and negative outcomes in his life based on his initiative. And that offends people. It's the same thing with Jesus. Jesus pissed people off because he was good, because he's shown as an exemplar of what is actually possible in the human condition. Charlie Kirk did the same thing. He was an excellent organizer. And that gave him celebrity status. It gave him attention. And many of these people on the left, these sick individuals who live in the sense of ressentiment, this inner shame, they want that. They want celebrity. They want people to look at them. And they saw Charlie getting that, saying and doing the opposite things that they were saying and doing, and they hated him for it. And these people exist all over the world. Now, the whole left-right paradigm, why I want to step away a little bit out of it is because most of my audience is centered around the United States. And in the United States, left-right has a very specific meaning. Left-right as a division exists politically within pretty much every country. But what exactly that entails is a little bit different. But that inner world, that disgusting monster of a person exists uniformly across cultures because shame is just part of the human condition. So these creatures exist here in Poland, even though left-right is a little bit different. But regardless of that aspect of it, the reaction of the public, both on the left and on the right, both the condemnation, the rightful condemnation of such an act, and the ridicule and the making fun of it that came from that set of sick individuals has culminated ultimately in some sort of realization. And many commentators are saying that the right has woken up to the idea that you cannot actually speak to the left, that time for conversation is over. And I mean, that's kind of like a red pilling that we had in the MGTOW space around women. You can't really negotiate with human nature. And you can't negotiate with that sort of sick creature is because they are beyond human salvation. In fact, I would say that the right and Charlie would have been guilty of the sin of pride in the sense that they actually believed they had the capacity to reach such a monster. And you don't. You don't. These people exist in various contexts outside of politics, like in dating as well. I've dealt a lot with these sort of women. And the men undoubtedly suffer in the same exact way. I've had incidents with people like this as well, people that resent you for just being happy, even being moderately successful, being social. I mean, any local positive trait you might possess, a person like this will resent you for. And the sin of pride here rests in the fact that these people can be saved, and they can't. Like only God can save them at this point, is what I've learned, is that their inner world is constructed in such a manner that precludes the possibility of salvation from man himself, because they're not dealing on rational grounds here. They're dealing with an internal hell that cannot be reasoned with. They're beyond reason, completely beyond reason. So this realization has come into being. But I think there's other things going on as well, is that if you can't negotiate with such people on political grounds, that means you're left on your own. And people really want to start taking matters into their own hands in general. And I think that's an excellent sentiment, except that there's too much implication that necessitates violence of some sort. Now, I don't usually make political videos, and I don't really think this is a political video per se. I'm just using the political situation that's evolving in America to kind of get more out of a deeper philosophical dimension of what's going on here. Now, I think what the right realized is that they're on their own, as in there is no team across the populace. And because they're on their own, they need to act in isolation towards the ends that they believe they wish to come into being, which is true. But now they have to learn a new mechanism of interacting with the system, because previously the paradigm was that you have a unified populace that differ on intellectual grounds who can be brought to a common ground through the act of speech supported by reason, through views informed by dialectic. Let's put it this way. But when you dismiss that as the roadmap, how are you going to interact with this thing? Because now you have a completely different paradigm. Now what you have is two alien species seemingly sharing a political system which you cannot find common ground with definitionally. I think that's where that hard truth hit, is that they have been humbled. The right has been humbled now that their superior linguistical skills are no match for the inner degeneracy of this faction of individuals, of these creatures that exist in the world. That's the humbling process that has been unfolded, which has generated a lot of anger. But when it comes down to taking things into your own hands, and many people who aren't even politically involved believe that, civil war is upon us, and I believe it's been upon us for quite a while now. Just people imagine it to be more like marching armies or just shooting in the streets, but I mean, it's been happening on a spiritual level, on a political level in the U.S. and all over the world. Actually, Europe is not really much different. I think the division between Europe and the United States is that the United States is about 10 years ahead in terms of the absolute degeneration of the state of affairs compared to Europe. Some may think Europe is worse. On the cultural side, I think Europe is a little bit still more conservative. Regardless, now you need a new mechanism of engaging in politics where you have a hostile alien creature who shares your political system. And the only thing that comes to mind seems to be violence. And that's why people hesitate to use rhetoric around the notion of taking things into your own hands. But I have a different solution. I have a very different solution of how to conceptualize philosophically this new state of affairs. And that is the case that you are building a parallel society. And this is not a new, or it's not only not a new and not an original idea, but it's not something that doesn't already exist. The Amish have built a parallel society within the greater society as a whole. And in that sense, the left-right divide can be breached by the fact that you don't need to interact with these individuals. And I think many commentators on YouTube are actually expressing this sentiment. They will no longer have anything to do with the leftist. I think they need to broaden that whole spectrum to say by the degenerate soul that constitutes what they actually hate, as opposed to simply the political position. But regardless, they will have nothing to do with the leftist. That means that you're going to share geography with an alien species who you will avoid all interactions with, if you can, and only focus on developing a society with the people who are more like you, which happens to be a political position right now. Now, the Amish have done this, and they're quite successful with it. They have isolated themselves. They have their own microeconomy that functions independent of the grander economy, but they don't have things like their own currency. They don't have their own banks. At least I don't think they do. They have their own churches, so they have their own faith. They have their own schools. And they're fine, and people think the Amish got it right in many ways. So the parallel society needs to take lessons from the Amish that the right needs to build for themselves. And this does not imply that they need to anchor themselves in the early or mid-19th century technologically like the Amish did. A lot of people love the sentiment of going back to the 1950s. In some sense, you can. In some sense, you can choose to abstain from certain technological wonders in your life to create a simulacrum of that state of conditions. The Amish have done it with all technology. The right, if they wish to reject things like social media because that's not part of their value system, can generate a parallel society where they encourage a way of living that does not necessitate the expulsion of technology from the geography in which they occupy, but it will necessitate the expulsion of certain things from the parallel society in which they existed. They will copy the Amish in that they will isolate themselves from the elements they do not desire and then dictate the rules, establish them for their own group that they do desire, and no longer attempt to convince this alien species to go along with them. Now, whether or not it's possible in terms of electing a leader that also governs the geography where this alien species resides is a different question. But many are also losing hope in the political process as well, even with Trump in power. Even the right side, a lot of criticism of Trump is going on. If this is the case, if you are losing, if people on the right who dominate all branches of government, as far as I know, I may be wrong, but they have a solid dominance over the formal institutions of government. If even under those conditions they're not getting what they desire and they are losing hope in politics to that extent where they now need to, entertain even the notions of civil war through violence, they can engage in civil war in a peaceful manner, meaning in that whole separatist parallel society manner. Now, violence may come upon them to be visited upon them in the sense of that the state still has some form of monopoly upon force, but they don't really, not in the United States. In most of Europe they do, but not in the United States. And so the two amendments within the U.S. that people always talk about is the First Amendment, so freedom of speech, and the Second Amendment, the right to own and bear arms. I don't think enough people on the right in America actually exercise these rights. And what this means is that they could do more to reassert them possessing it without actually having to step out of their everyday life cycle. And this is what I mean. Let us do a little thought experiment here. Let us say the right decide to distinguish themselves as a separate species from the left, and they wish to do it passively, but in public. What could they do? Well, they could have a uniform. And what exactly would this uniform entail? I mean, I'm imagining two specific articles that really hammer home what it is that they stand for. The first being a gun, a pistol, so that anytime a right-winger goes outdoors, they have a pistol on their belt, and that's part of their uniform. It shows that they're serious. Now, in the United States, this is possible because most states allow for open carry. And the thing about it is, it has to be open carry. It has to be visible. Because part of the reason is that other people are meant to see it, and not just the left, but also other members of the right, so they can identify one of their own, those that are part of this parallel society. But that in and of itself is not sufficient. There's one more symbol that needs to be added to the mix to really hammer this message home, and that is the cross. They need to wear a cross over their shirt so that when someone is walking around, they can pinpoint to one of their own by seeing a gun, seeing the values that stay the hand for the gun itself, the cross itself. And that's how it is. I would say a predominance of the right is Christian. U.S. is a Christian country, regardless of what anybody says. And the Christian value system is what people are ultimately trying to defend when they're talking about traditional values. I mean, there is no tradition that supersedes Christianity in America. In Europe, there's the pagan faiths, but that doesn't apply to the United States. And this is very possible to execute. Wear the cross, wear the gun. The cross tells others what you believe, what stays your hand. The gun says that you're serious, that it's best to, let's just say, engage in a cordial manner. And the fact of the matter is, no one needs to become aggressive. It's not like you carry the weapon for the sake of using it. You carry it for the sake of not needing to use it as a deterrent. As we know, the whole MAD doctrine of everybody having nuclear weapons so nobody uses it, it's kind of similar to this. And Americans have the right to do this. There's nothing new that they need to introduce legislation-wise in order to enact this sort of uniform, what I'm describing. The cross represents your freedom of speech, your freedom of religion, and also represents your freedom of association. And the gun represents, well, your Second Amendment as well, your right to own and bear arms. And though many Americans, I think a third of you guys, own arms, I doubt that many of you bear arms. So you're really only exercising a portion of that freedom. And those that don't actually exercise their freedoms are no better off than those who don't have these freedoms. Much in the same way that someone who does not read is no better off than someone who cannot read. And civic duty then becomes just that, symbolizing that there are certain values that need to stay sacred within the country itself, and they need to be continuously thrown in the face of everyone else in the culture as existing. And this sort of uniform would very much make these claims without having to do anything in your life out of the ordinary, without having to rally or anything like that. Now, again, this is all part of this whole thought experiment. Whether or not people take this or take a portion of it and then rejigger it, whatever happens in the U.S. happens. But what I would say is there's another escalation that can happen, which is nonviolent, but it's definitely aggressive. And that's the fact, the part of baring teeth. So before a dog attacks you, it growls at you, it bares its teeth. It shows you it means business, but it's not yet violent. Now, what if protesting, which is now being spoken of not really being reliable, that it makes no difference? Well, maybe maybe that whole movement needs to look at protesting and say that maybe it's not being taken seriously is because there's no teeth baring. There's no growling happening at the same time during these peaceful protests. But what if everybody was armed at such a peaceful protest? What if all the protesters wore this uniform? They all came with their cross. They all came with a gun. No one's meant to use it, but now it's a symbol to the federal government, to a local government, is that we've come with words, but we also have nonverbal modes of communication if that collapses. So it's not about being aggressive in that sense that you stop being polite, you start being pushy. It's more like, we understand the reality. We would love to stick with speech. We love speech. We have a whole right governing it. But we also have a solution when speech collapses. And now we're forced to basically remind everybody that we have this other solution. So if you had 100,000 people at a protest with guns, you've basically brought back the government's fear of the people, because now you have an army that is saying we want something. It's no longer just unarmed people that are being controlled by, say, a military force, which is, the police force of a local city. You have a protest, say, in D.C., and you have, obviously, the armed police hanging around. Pretty much no one has a weapon there. It's possible that the instructions are not to bring weapons, but perhaps that ought to change. And what is that police force going to do? Are they going to shoot into a crowd of 100,000 armed men and women? I don't think so. I think there's going to be a very visceral fear, even in the police force that's meant to keep the peace around this particular crowd. And this crowd, this peaceful protest, will be taken far more seriously. And there's going to be far less of a likelihood of an incident in terms of that group. Now, obviously, there's the whole fear of false flags and whatnot. But then again, you have 100,000 people with guns. So if one agent provocateur decides to pull out the gun and start shooting or waving it around, what do you think all the non-agent provocateurs are going to do? They're going to draw a gun, and there's going to be a little firing squad around this individual very quickly. So there's going to be a fear of even trying to stage an incident because everybody is armed. So that is a level of escalation that carries on the spirit of peaceful protest, the spirit of freedom of speech and resolving conflict through language, but it escalates. But it escalates. It shows you're serious. It's growling. It's baring your teeth. So that direction is something that can be entertained. In the United States, in Europe, don't really have these freedoms. Which brings the commentary back to the European side is people need to be fighting for these freedoms. We are not allowed to bear arms here openly. Though in Poland the laws of owning guns are fairly loose, you can't just walk around with a gun. That's not normal. That's not normal. I don't think it's legal. There might be law. I'm not as well versed in it, but for sure there's no culture around this. America has that culture. But within the UK protests are an excellent example. Just recently, what was there, like 500,000, 1 million people rallied in the streets? They were obviously all unarmed, theoretically. Now imagine that 1 million people had guns. If that was legal, of course, we stay within the law. But if they had guns, they would be treated far more seriously. Now, how do we bring about, say in Europe, a change where we have an equal ability to defend the nation locally here? Well, protest to get these rights. So you get 1 million people with baseball bats, not as good as a gun, still armed, still somewhat dangerous, especially in a mass of 1 million people, to show up and protest, to demand of the government to grant them the right to own and bear arms, just like in the United States. And obviously the First Amendment, freedom of speech, push for those things, that those should be active demands upon the government within European nations as well, amongst those who organize things. That's something you can actually fight for, so that what you're doing is you're building infrastructure to arm the public so the government fears the public as opposed to the other way around, as it should be. So I think a big realization that's coming into the common consciousness is that the people are on their own in every facet. And because they're on their own, they need to start strategizing on how to do it in a manner that reflects their values, which are peaceful values. And this is a way to do it. You start baring teeth. You start making the cross a symbol of respect. Respect derived by the fear that comes from the gun on the hip. In that sense, that there needs to be a perception of Christians as serious people, in that sense that they're not pacifists. Pacifism is all well and good, but the ability to defend yourself is not a pacifistic value. The will to defend yourself is not a pacifistic value. So pacifism doesn't work in mass in politics and all that. The whole story of Gandhi and hunger strikes and all that is only a half-truth. The other half is that there was a military and a general using force on the back end, motivating some of this liberation of India. If you actually talk to people, which I have friends who live in India, I lived in India, I know a different side of this story as well. That side is never talked about. Regardless. So there has to be a baring of teeth. There has to be an escalation. There has to be a taking it into your own hands without losing your own values dimension to it. And this is a potential suggestion of how to achieve this. I'm not a political organizer. I don't dabble in politics usually. I'm more on the philosophical side. So I'll just play my part in this sense and philosophize about what can be done. How can that all unify to solve these practical problems, these applied ethical problems of philosophy in the real world, in the political sphere? So yeah, there's a lot of shift happening. Consciousness is shifting, and as I've spoken of in one of my other videos about Jean Gebser's The Ever-Present Origin and how we're going from a mental structure of consciousness into integral structure. And one thing I never mentioned in that video, at least I don't think I did, is that integrality is thematically linked with diaphany. And diaphany is basically transparency. And if we look at what's happening, everything is becoming more and more transparent. People are seeing through things. They're seeing more clearly of the whole scope of what's going on. And the government has less places to hide. And other factions have less places to hide. And this diaphanous experience is actually depressing people to a great degree, because before, things that were hidden, things that were out of mind, are now coming to the forefront, and people are realizing the world is not really the way that they would like it to be. They've imagined it to be the way they've been told it is. And what they are learning is not like a elevated positive dimension. They're seeing like the ugly underbelly of what's been going on all along. That this isn't something that just started happening recently, but that's been going on all along. But now they see it. They have a diaphanous experience of these phenomena, and they're all depressing. They're all fairly horrific. But given enough time, I think people will settle in and renormalize in their sense of hope in the world, that all of this negativity being unleashed upon them now is crushing their hope because it's coming at them very quickly. But that'll stop eventually. I think a majority of what was already disgusting about the truth of the world has already been revealed. I think people are slowly acclimating to it, and now they're trying to figure out a way to manage this new reality that they're living in. And this shift of consciousness is transpiring very well before our eyes. The rhetoric just after the assassination of Charlie Kirk, as people are saying everything has changed. Have you noticed that, people are different? It's this this ambiguity in language where people sense something, but they don't know how to verbalize it. They don't have a conceptual framework to wrap it into a unity, to give them clarity. And that clarity then can be transformed into a direction. They don't possess this yet because it's all new. To me, I've been with the philosophical space for almost 20 years. I've read such a great deal of things, both from the East, from the West, from ancient philosophy leading out to the contemporary material, that I do possess a language for it. So to me, it's less invasive because as things unfold, I can integrate them within a framework that makes it intelligible. Whereas others, it's almost random. It's scary because it's unknown. It's random. You can't make sense of it immediately. But that's what's going on. There's a big shift of consciousness out of the mental structure into this integral element where the old will be rediscovered once again. Now, think about in practice what all these protests around the world actually mean beyond the political dimension. It means that people are now congregating in large groups again. That means that even though it's a protest, they're practicing their socializing skills. They're getting back into the groove of being around other people, of getting out of the house, of engaging with the world socially, but with the physical material world in large groups. And if you spend enough time engaged in that sort of socializing, even in the context of protest, you're probably not going to really want to go back to isolating yourself in the house. You're going to find, okay, well, protests were all well and good, but I kind of miss being around people. Could we go out? Could we do something? It's that reintroduction of the social sphere. And perhaps all this turmoil, all this political crises is good for at least this. It's getting people out of the house. It's people realizing that they need to do something in the physical material world. And more importantly, that they actually have the power to do it. And beyond the power to do it is that there's no one coming to save them, that they have to do it. I think a lot of this talk about what happened after the Charlie Kirk assassination is this realization, is that A, they're on their own, B, they have the power to act in the material world, and 3, no one's coming to save them, therefore they have to act. In this parallel society, which can emerge, much like the Amish have had. The Amish are peaceful. They don't operate amongst most of like the social norms and rules that the wider mainstream does. And yet somehow, nobody hates them. Nobody bothers them. They got their own thing going on. They're left alone. And actually people have a general positive opinion of them. That same aspect can be recreated in mass. Simply put, the right wing needs to take care of their own. They need a uniform to identify their own in the real world as opposed to online. And even then to look out after their own. People have a hard time engaging with a stranger. And I think this aspect of a uniform, whatever form it takes, though I think the cross and the gun actually is a pretty good one, it also tells you who's part of your tribe. And that also means that there should be an expectation of certain permissiveness, that you can go up and say hi. You make eye contact with another person wearing a gun and a cross. You say, good morning. They say they see you in your uniform, good morning. They know, you both know you're all part of the same clique, the same tribe, that you belong to a certain belief system, a value system. And then if you see one of these people wearing this uniform in trouble, that they have some sort of confrontation, an argument, you can intervene, but you don't need to intervene in any aggressive manner. You could just stand next to them. Just cross your arms. Say nothing. And just look at the interlocutor with whom your fellow tribe member is having a conflict with. Just look at them, see how they're behaving. Now all of a sudden, this aggressive person, let us say it's a leftist, is no longer arguing with a single individual, but now they're arguing with two individuals who are both armed. Now if you are yet another person of this particular group wearing the same uniform, see two individuals standing, well, maybe that's your cue to go stand to the other side of this individual. Now you have the original person having a conflict with someone who has an armed person on his left, an armed person on their right. Neither are saying anything. The conflict carries on, but all of a sudden you're defending your own without engaging in anything yourself. You're not getting involved, but you're getting involved. It's an escalation. It's showing your teeth. It's that growling that I'm talking about. And think about it. If you inculcate into this culture that you wear this uniform and you're meant to look out for your own, only for your own, you do not intervene for everybody. Remember, we have an alien species seemingly coexisting on the same geography. That's not who you go to help. You may choose to, if you so wish. There's no, say, expectation of it. But if you're going up and, helping your own because you can identify your own in public, I think that also bridges that hope in humanity, that people are together, that they're unified, that it's a safe place. And would you feel safe in such a situation, wearing a cross, having a gun, and everybody around you is wearing a cross, having a gun? I think you would feel very safe, very, very safe. And I think by virtue of also that safety, because of the known, the clarity, the diaphany of the value system of the people wearing the uniform, that would also act as a scarecrow to the undesirables, who are the ones who would never put on a cross ever, because probably it would burn their skin or something. Those people are going to want to avoid those seeming individuals, and they're not going to want to start trouble because they know if there's any others around who are wearing that same uniform, they're going to come up and just stand there and watch. And that's how you escalate peacefully. That's how you carry on the conversation, where now your words carry weight because you're showing your teeth, but you're not biting. So yeah, that's where I think we are. That's where I think things can head and still remain peaceful. We'll see what happens, because things are quite intense out there. For now, though, thanks for listening. Hope this was useful. Go team.